Melbourne International Film Festival acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we live, learn and work, and pays respect to their elders past and present and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. MIFF celebrates the history and contemporary creativity of the world's oldest living culture. My name is Alexei Toliopoulos. I'm a comedian and host of the weekly film podcast Total Reboot and pop culture investigator on ABC's Finding Drago and Finding Desperado. And it is my distinct privilege and pleasure to host this MIFF Talks session. And MIFF Talks are presented in partnership with the University of Melbourne. And this one in particular is very exciting because this one brings together some of my favorite pop culture aficionados in the country while we talk about consuming culture. Pandemic habits is what follows the colon on this title. I'm thrilled to be joined by a perfect panel of culture vultures. Joining me today is Osman Faruqi, an award-winning journalist and host of Schwartz Media's weekly podcast, The Culture, and editor of the daily news podcast, 7am. How are you, Oz?
Can't wait to talk about film with everyone.
Oh, my Lord. And we are going to be talking about film all of this session with also Dr. Janice Loreck, who is a lecturer in screen and culture studies at the University of Melbourne, a terrific critic and author and organizer of the Melbourne Women in Film Festival. How are you doing today in Melbourne?
Oh, I'm great, Alexei. How are you?
I'm good, but I'm in Sydney, so maybe a little less good than you guys are at the moment.
Hey, we're all in this together. I mean that, actually, yes.
And also rounding out the panel is Beverley Wang, the co-host of Stop Everything on ABC Radio National, a journalist, producer, and, in my opinion, one of the greatest popular culture podcasters in the entire nation. Beverley, how are you today?
Thank you so much.
That is my thing. I love to flatter people so we can all feel comfortable around each other and really get excited about talking about film, movies, screen culture, and consuming habits while being inside a global pandemic.
Don't know why I'm laughing, but yeah, let's do it.
Well, that's all we can do. I want to kick things off today by kind of throwing a question around the panel. We're about, to my estimation, about 48 years into this pandemic, and I would love to kind of know where we all started, like instinctually, where we went to during that first month of lockdown. What did we go to for comfort? Beverley, I'd like to hear from you first.
Wow. I'm thinking back to the beginning of the pandemic, and remember people were so excited by Zoom things, Zoom concerts, Zoom comedy gigs. SNL went away, they didn't know what to do, and then they came back and they had like that Zoom show. It was big news. And then look where we are now. Like, we cannot actually get away from Zoom, like it's actually hell. So we've gone on a roller coaster. We're kind of on a Zoom call right now, so we can't actually escape it. I'm trying to think of what I watched at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's just like a gray sheet. I can't actually, that's not good for this conversation, but I'll tell you where I am now. I'm into like limited series. I'm loving all of these 6-part prestige series that have been on HBO recently, The White Lotus, Mayor of Easttown. None of them have any reference to COVID. And I actually was wondering about, you know, for a time we got really excited when TV shows and films acknowledged COVID. And now I just don't even care. It's fine for them to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I watched an episode of like Law and Order, organized crime, and they were wearing masks. I'm like, you know what? Maybe not today. I'm not going to chuck this one on today for my comfort watch. Janice, do you remember what you were getting into like when we first started locking those doors?
Oh, gosh, that's a really difficult question for me because I had just moved across the country and I just started a new job, in fact. So I was actually doing a lot of viewing related to my work, so watching lots of films that I wanted my students to watch. But I think the other thing that I did actually is I wanted to get away from screens quite a lot, and I started reading again a lot more. I actually started reading, as in children's literature. I read, lots of Philip Pullman actually during the very first lockdown. And I also remember watching just a lot of free-to-air broadcast television, just putting it on, having that noise in the background, kind of like a comforting drone. And I think I ended up watching a lot of reality TV, just anything that happened to be programmed at the time lots of repeats of Friends and Big Bang Theory and all of those sitcoms that are just programmed hour after hour after hour. So I think I don't know if I consumed my television very consciously at that time, but I do remember wanting to get away from the television at times and do some reading as well.
I think as well for like people like us where like watching movies and watching TV is your job, in those first few weeks of the lockdown where like jobs kind of didn't exist, but then also were the only things that existed, I too like went back to like reading fiction, which I hadn't read in ages, and just like kind of trying to get absorbed into a story that maybe didn't burn my eyes quite as much as I'm used to. And I also like, for me, I got really stuck into like either catching up with movies that I hadn't seen before, trying to keep that discovery and exploratory way, but also like going into those really long epics. Like first thing I put on when I felt that first pang of depression was The Godfather Part 1 and 2, to just feel really soaked up and absorbed by something that was also very familiar. And I remember talking to you, Oz, like around that same time, because you were also watching the Godfather trilogy.
I watched the Godfather trilogy probably like 3 times in the past, year and a half, just as something that is, like you said, like warm and comforting and familiar. And I actually remember talking to my therapist about why I felt so comfortable watching things that I had seen before, or things that were very contained. And basically they explained to me is that you're looking for something where the stakes are low, either because the worst thing that could happen in a sitcom like The Big Bang Theory is an argument that gets resolved at the end of an episode, or something like The Godfather where you know what's going to happen and you're watching it to that joy of the cinematic kind of brilliance. But I actually had a much more, I'm going to say like slightly deranged viewing habit that emerged at the start of the pandemic last year. I watched Steven Soderbergh's Contagion maybe like 15 times in the first month of the pandemic. And I continue to watch it almost fortnightly. And it has been one of the most weird experiences of my life, but still kind of satisfying experiences. And I remember when you go back and you watch that movie at the start of the pandemic and you watch it now, not only is it, I think, a really satisfying and deeply, deeply, contemplative and really, really well-made movie, it is a movie that famously was made with very close consultation with the WHO and captured so much of where we are now years and years ago. And I remember watching it at the start of the pandemic and being like, oh, okay, cool. This is where like viruses come from. And then you'd watch it like a month later and, oh, cool. We're at the point now where there are like mass graves in New York City. Cool. That's happening in real life. Then you'd watch it like 6 months later and it's like, oh, cool. They found a vaccine. That's where we are now. And then you watch it again. And it's like, oh, now there's vaccine passports. It was just this weird experience of seeing our future lives play out in this movie. And as I'm saying all of this out loud to you guys, I'm realizing that perhaps I've done something very wrong and I've lost my mind. But it was what I did.
Yeah, I'm a little sickened by this, Oz, that you've got like the blueprint mapped out and you keep checking it, seeing how it's going.
A very prescient film. Well, the really interesting thing about that movie is Soderbergh did this amazing interview with the New York Times about a month into the pandemic, where it wasn't just me. Like, I know it sounds like I'm crazy, but it was a very well documented phenomenon that a lot of people were turning to movies like Outbreak, which is the Dustin Hoffman kind of pandemic movie, or Contagion. And Soderbergh was interviewed about it, and he said the one thing scientifically that we fudged in this movie to make it fit into the narrative and to not make it boring was how quickly a vaccine would be developed. I think in the kind of timeline of the movie, it's developed within 12 and 18 months. And he said, look, the scientists, when I talked to them, said it's going to be 5 to 7 years. And that terrified me, because at that time I was like, wow, everything else in this movie is right. We are so screwed when it comes time to getting a vaccine. But then we did it. So if anything, I don't know, maybe the movie gave scientists the encouragement to get their shit together and to make this vaccine. I think we owe Soderbergh a debt of gratitude.
And the thing I love about that movie and the way that it's come back is, I remember when it came out, I saw it in the cinema when it came out, and it was good. It didn't get fabulous reviews, and there was some, it's been a while, but I remember there were some aspects with the pacing, and of course I had my critic brain on. I thought, could be improved here and there. But I think it just goes to show the ways that movies can come back and play a really important cultural role that isn't necessarily obvious when they first come out. And I really love that. I love that this movie now has a cultural place that it didn't initially have.
Talking about Soderbergh, I've been watching other films in his oeuvre, if you will. I started watching Magic Mike and Magic Mike XXL during the pandemic. And Magic Mike is art. It is art, right? And then I watched Magic Mike XXL, which is not a Soderbergh film. And at first I was very disappointed because I thought, these guys in the background, they're talking too much. There's too much dialogue. There's too much setup. But then I got into it and I was like, this movie is sex positive, it's age positive, it's body positive, it's everything positive, it's centering female pleasure. There's so much respect. The number of cameos, Donald Glover, Andy McDowell, so many others that I can't remember. And that was a little beam of light. And when the lockdown ended in Melbourne, I think between 4 and 5. Yes, because now we're doing 5 and 6. I actually got to go to the Magic Mike XXL live show, and that was incredible. Thank you, Channing Tatum.
Did you feel like you became part of the movie?
Sorry.
Did you feel like you became? Did you feel like you became one with the movie at that point? Were you completely submerged?
You know what? The Magic Mike XXL show is art, theater. There is story at the beginning.
Wow.
I don't want to spoil it. But you go in there thinking one thing, and then another thing happens. There's narrative. So yeah, I guess I did feel
experience.
I was inside. Yeah.
Whoa. That's the experience. It starts out as art, then it becomes a little more mainstream, then you get swept up and immersed in art in the real life show.
That's right.
Before Beverley, you said that it's not a Soderbergh movie, Magic Mike XXL, but if it makes you feel better, Gregory Jacobs, who directed it, he was the AD on Magic Mike. He's been the AD on a lot of Soderbergh movies, like Eric Roberts, Out of Sight. So it's kind of as close to Soderbergh as you can get without it being him. So it's partly why I think it's so great.
Right.
Beverley, you really touched on something I want to get into here as far as like pandemic viewing goes. I feel like a lot of people set like little missions for themselves doing like these kind of prescribed deep dives like you did on Soderbergh. And like kind of, I feel like I live my life in a deep dive. I haven't seen The Surface in years and I've got the bends from popular culture big time. Janice, I was wondering if you went into any of those missions as well, like explorations into like filmographies or something like that.
Oh, yes. I mean, for one thing, I'm writing a book on provocative women filmmakers, so I made myself a really long list of all of the most shocking, outrageous films ever made by women. So that was what I was doing a lot of last year. And also just watching films from a single director, I think, and that's a really common kind of cinephile thing to do, is just to watch one after the other, after the other, after the other. And I think when you have that time to do it and you have every single night of the week free, well, then that's a great opportunity to watch one after the other. And I did watch a lot of the films of Claire Denis, which, you know, is a classic, of course, French filmmaker who I'm expected to know all these sorts of things about. But that was such a wonderful experience. That was during the big Melbourne lockdown as well. But I think there are many different ways of doing this. For example, at the moment, I'm swapping horror film recommendations with friends. And I think if you enjoy horror as a genre, it's actually a really fun, thrilling, escapist genre to get into. And there's so much of it. There's so much on Netflix. There's so much on other streaming services that it can be such a really fun exercise because you feel that there's so much available to you there. So I really do think that people are using this as an opportunity to catch up on their viewing and to be a bit more completionist around certain genres or filmmakers.
I got to ask, what were some of the rare gems you uncovered in your genre study?
Of horror cinema?
Yeah, in horror. What did you uncover that you want to share with us?
Oh, well, I saw The Descent the other day, the 2005 film about the group of women who get caught in the cave. And I'd never seen that before. And I couldn't believe, it's this really claustrophobic horror film where these women are inside and they're trapped inside a cave. And it was just so realistic. And of course, some supernatural things happen as they go along. But for me, it was scary enough just being set inside this really terrifying claustrophobic cave. Now, I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I love being taken out of my everyday circumstance and being, immersed in a really thrilling viewing experience. So definitely that one. Ooh, and I did recommend a really great Irish horror film actually called A Dark Song, which is also a really claustrophobic, low-budget horror film from Ireland where some people get inside a house and they undertake some magic spells inside the house. So that was a really excellent one too. So horror, it's a great genre to engage with during a pandemic, I think.
Did you find yourself like diving into specific genres or giving yourself missions as well in exploration to keep things fresh?
It's so interesting because I totally did. I didn't necessarily go down a genre or specific director path, but I used it as an opportunity to try and catch up with those quote unquote classic movies that everyone talks about that you pretend to watch, but you only really know because The Simpsons has like parodied it. So for me, that was things like 12 Angry Men and Vertigo and On the Beach. And I think maybe I'd seen them or they'd been on, my parents had watched them and I was kind of familiar with them, but or maybe I just consumed so much pop culture around them, I thought I didn't need to watch them. So I used this as an opportunity to sort of sit down and go through those classic films from the 40s and 50s. And turns out they're pretty good. Everyone should get around them. And maybe my embarrassing one, I'd seen Casablanca once before and loved it. But I watched it again last year in the middle of the Melbourne lockdown. And obviously, not only do I love it, I think it's one of the most amazing films made, but to go back to what you were saying, Janice, about movies that might, like obviously Casablanca didn't disappear without a trace when it came out, but movies can take on a new kind of meaning depending on our context. And the kind of explicit anti-Nazi politics of that film just felt so important in the context of everything that's going on in the world. And I just thought for a movie that is that old to have something that just connected with me now was both kind of exciting and thrilling, but also a little bit sad because it's like, damn, we dealt with this like 7 years ago. Why are Nazis back? And why is this movie making me think about them?
I think it's so interesting because it's a film that was made during the middle of a crisis and where it was a film that was put together to kind of encourage Americans, really, the American population, to say, oh, we actually do have to get involved in this conflict. And that's the Humphrey Bogart character. He represents the reluctant hero American. And I think that narrative about having to take responsibility for the things that are happening in the world, well, yeah, I think we find ourselves in a moment of crisis again. And I can see how that resonates within a new context. So I think, again, it just shows how these great movies do come back. And also I've noticed in this conversation, we've been talking a lot about older films and finally feeling the opportunity to catch up with the films that we've missed or that we have always been on our list. And so the pressure of seeking out the new has been removed and now we can actually start filling in the gaps in our viewing. And so I do see that as a really positive thing myself.
Mm.
Yeah, I think you hit on something that's like really key to me about this last year experience as like a audience member is that, so much of the cinephile experience and the movie fan experience and the pop culture lover experience is like sharing pop culture and those shared experiences that you have where you are either all in sync inside a cinema physically and then you can come out and discuss it, which is such a big part of like the film festival experience. And I think that was the thing that I really struggled with the most was like having those conversations still and kind of having those shared viewing experiences. And there were moments where pop culture seemed to sync up on stuff like Tiger King, where everyone seemed to be watching it at the same time. And then there was a never-ending conversation around it. Like, I still know too much about the Tiger King. I know that Joe Exotic had coronavirus. I should have known that information, but it's just buried in my head. it's stuck there forever. But I think that was the thing that I truly missed the most, was those shared experiences. Beverley, were there ways for you around kind of creating those shared experiences again over the last year and having those feelings of connectivity through popular culture?
You know, it's funny that you mentioned Tiger King, because that was so early in the lockdown where we were still enthusiastic about doing things together. And I remember one of the things that we did on our show was we did a Netflix watch party, and we watched with like 75 people or however many you can have join that party, episode 1 of Tiger King. And that was so, after I came off that hour, you know, you're in that group and you're group messaging rapidly. I was like so wired and so like buzzed about the whole thing. It took a long time to come down. And it's also making me think about going back to watch a movie in the theaters. A few times that theaters have opened up, and I remember going to see Godzilla versus Kong. And like, that's a movie I think that is made for shouting during the film. It's so noisy. It was so noisy. And I was with Maria Lewis, who's like a film critic, I'm sure that you all know. And the two of us,
one of my best friends,
it's just yelling in the theater, like really loud. Not that many people were joining in with us, but the movie was so loud. I was like, I have a feeling they've done this so that your screams can get drowned out in the crowd noise. It was so satisfying to do that. I love that. I think like going to TV, I think there have been some moments of collective engagement. Like if you ever go on Twitter while MasterChef is on, you will see MasterChef up to your eyeballs, right? Same thing is happening now with Survivor. I think with like the limited series, Mayor of Easttown, I got really into that. There was a lot of that and a lot of the speculation. So that kind of, I have to say, I really enjoyed that. Like when everybody, it seemed like in the whole English-speaking world, was trying to figure out who killed Aaron McMenamin, and there were all these listicles and like what were the probabilities. I really enjoyed that because I think maybe to go back to what Oz was saying about low threshold entertainment. Yeah, Mayor of Easttown is about a murder, but it's fiction. It's still not that high stakes. It's still weirdly, I'm going to say, light relief. So I think there have been moments where, like you said, Alexei, people have caught up with each other and enjoyed things together.
But
That was a great answer. I just got lost in it.
I think if I could jump in, I think people are drawn to detective genres in moments of crisis or uncertainty. I think there's a reason why they sell paperback detective fiction at the airport or at the train station. I think because, generally speaking, this terrible catastrophe will be resolved by some genius investigator or some persistent investigator. And we all know that narrative arc, and it's really satisfying. And now I haven't watched Mayor of Easttown, but I can imagine that you find this character very compelling, and there's a sense that there will be some resolution around this. So, yeah, I'm not at all surprised that these classic genres come back and become popular at such moments.
Yeah, you really just spoke something so true to me then, Janice, because like I'm usually just a movie watcher. I don't usually watch too much TV, but over the last month, I watched 13 years worth of Law and Order SVU because it delivered that exact comfort of sometimes I've seen an episode before, sometimes it's a brand new experience for me, but it's the exact same feeling each episode. It's the exact same arc each episode. It's that comfort of just kind of knowing that things are going to be somewhat resolved by the end, and Ice-T is going to have a couple of great one-liners, and Richard Belzer is going to be extremely charming, talking about a conspiracy theory at some point. But it's just like that comfort that you can just let it wash over you, where, you know, a lot of the times when you're working at home, the TV is just on and you can't stop it from being on, and just need those kind of really easy comfort watches like that are still gripping at the same time. And I think detective stuff and the procedural is the absolute like perfect thing for that experience. And it's what so many people have been enveloped by recently.
Yeah,
can I go back to this idea of
who wants to go?
Everyone
Who wants to go?
Do you want to go?
I was changing the topic, so someone else should go who's on this topic.
Oh, I was going to say, I think maybe, Janice, you can relate, like a lot of us ladies who like to watch Law & Order SVU, and it's like this funny joke. It's like, this is a show about sex crimes, but why do I find it relaxing? And it's kind of a joke. Like, why do women like true crime podcasts? It's a stereotype, but there's a little bit of truth in it. You're an academic. Tell us, why do the ladies like the true crime? Why do we find this so relaxing to watch people solve these kinds of horrible crimes? Like, in real life, no way. But for some reason, they come on the scene SVU, and you're just like, yes, I hear the theme. I can hear it now, and I'm pleased. I'm relaxed.
I think there are definitely times where we don't want to confront dark things, but I think actually we do want to confront dark things a lot because we're aware of these things happening in the world. And I think that true crime podcasts or narrative fiction provide a safe way where you can confront our worst nightmares and our worst nightmares as women, absolutely. And also, a lot of these shows have women as the detective and women who solve the case. And I think that that's incredibly potent and powerful for women viewers as well, because it's about the loss of control and the regaining of control and being able to make sense of these things when they happen. So that's my theory about why they appeal. I'm not sure if that rings true for others.
I mean, that's why it appeals to me. That's exactly why it appeals to me. Oz, you were going to say something?
I was just going to, on this question that you guys were talking about before about collective viewing. It's something I've been thinking about so much because I think you guys mentioned the Tiger King. I remember The Last Dance. They were the last two big sort of phenomenons that it seemed like the whole world was getting around. And it made me think about why movies and cinema going is so important and why that's felt like it's been lacking in the last 18 months. It's not just the idea of being in a room with everyone together. I think that's obviously a big part of it for so many people like me that love cinema. But it's this idea that in a world that is so fragmented, and I don't mean like ideologically or politically, obviously that is happening, but just even in simple terms of like when you watch something, even if a show comes out at the same time, you might see in your group of friends, people watch it over months, right? Rather than over the course of a couple of weeks, over the course of the 6-week run that it's on. And it's so rare to have something that we all kind of get around now. And this might sound like a little bit strange, but we've just kind of come off the back of the Olympics. And the Olympics, I wouldn't consider to be like cinematic viewing necessarily, but I feel like what it afforded a lot of us, and it's one of the reasons why I got into it so deeply, was it was this weird moment in a world where no one watches the same thing at the same time, where like hundreds of millions of people were watching the same thing at the same time, having that collective experience, sharing it on social media, talking about it to friends and colleagues. It was just really heartwarming and uplifting. And it made me think, I just can't wait to get back to that. And I think, Bev, when you're talking about some of those HBO limited series things, that also seems to come out like as the kind of boundaries collapse between cinema and TV. We're kind of getting this sweet spot where every year we get 2 or 3 prestige shows that we all watch and talk about at the same time. And they're so fun and exciting because it brings that joyous touching, which is sharing and talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think sharing is such a, when you say that, all it's about the Olympics, to be able to see those triumphal moments, we know there's politics, whatever, but just like that pure emotion is a really rare thing. And it's kind of wholesome. Like, here we are in a pandemic, politics are shit, the pandemic is shit, but like still we have this instinct, like we want to enjoy things together and share things together and like things together. I think that's actually really lovely and wholesome and sweet.
Yes, and I would say that this has been around. We used to talk about water cooler television and appointment viewing, where everybody would sit down at 7 o'clock or 7:30 on a Wednesday and watch The Simpsons or something like that. And that's something that is increasingly getting lost because of streaming and video on demand. And so even though people love the convenience of streaming and video on demand, we see that things like sporting events or things like those big reality television shows that screen on certain weeknights, they do well because they can draw upon that sense of occasion that is often missing from streaming services. So I think that's one reason why they survive, and I think that's one reason why these standout shows like The Last Dance or Mayor of Easttown really do manage to cut through. And you mentioned Tiger King before. I didn't watch Tiger King, and I feel like I've missed that. Even though it's still there for me to watch, I've missed the moment. So there's still a sense of occasion around some of these TV shows, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is.
Totally,
Like it
totally.
was a total movement, and now it's hard to even go back or think about watching it again. It was just that one beautiful moment where it took over the entire culture. I think as well, like one of the things that I found like a real lifesaver, as far as like these feelings of connections go, has been that shift of film festivals and that film festival experience going online. And I think that there's been this kind of like accessibility open up to those by now them becoming online. Like last year when MIFF had its moment to first go online was probably the first time I felt a cinematic experience happen at home, which was the closing night film, which was Pablo Larraín's amazing dance thriller Emma. And it was truly the only time that I feel like I've had a new and exploratory cinematic experience at home, because the power of the colors in that film and the light just really emanated off my screen and like covered my whole room, and the sound quality was like as good as you can ever imagine happening on streaming. And then that leading from there, because it was a film that everyone was watching at the same time within like a certain group of people, a certain circle of like Australian cinephiles and Australian movie fans, where there was like that connection again. That was the thing that I'd been really missing, was just a shared experience of sharing something art that was not just, you know, a reality TV show or a documentary miniseries or something, where it was just something that was exclusively a film. And Janice, I want to kind of talk to you about Melbourne Women in Film Festival as well. Like, how have you seen like the attitudes and audiences shift as far as like the film festival experience goes?
Well, people are certainly much more open to the online experience this time round, and in many cases it's a really great opportunity to reach people who normally wouldn't. Our festival is very Melbourne-centric, of course. However, we now have the ability to reach people in other states without them having to come over here. Also, we can have guests and interviews and over things like Zoom or Skype that, yes, we could have done before, but it's much more normalized and very easy to actually accomplish. I still think the challenge is, of course, with anything like a festival or a film screening, you still want to create that sense of community around viewing something together and to make it a special moment. So I think it's really important for online festivals to build that sense of community around their event, give people an opportunity to exchange their thoughts or to interact about it. So I think there are pros and cons, and I have seen it done well, actually. I think there's some fantastic people out there who are really bringing their film community together in an online space and finding a way to do it. And I went to some great online film festivals last year and I had a blast. And it's because these people, they've worked really hard to build their online community. And yes, they do have that opportunity for exchange.
And Oz and Beverley, so much of like your podcast and broadcasting work is about like starting and kind of shaping conversations around popular culture and around culture. Have you felt like your attitudes shift in how you present them and kind of what you want your audiences to be part of as well?
That's a really interesting question because I've thought about how my viewing choices have changed as a result of knowing that part of my job is to watch things and then talk to people about them and engage in a conversation. I've got my co-host, but I'm also thinking about when I'm talking, I'm talking to the audience simultaneously. And I think that's one of the really lovely things is that people will respond to what you're saying, what you think, agree or disagree. And there is a collective conversation. So I think it has made, at a personal level, I guess, the pandemic less lonely because you know that you can catch onto something and have this conversation with people. You're still maintaining this external contact, which is really important. And I think what is really important is just not to have any snobbery about what people like or don't like, and not to have any judgment about this attitude about reality TV or yada, yada, yada. I don't own a TV, all that nonsense, own a TV, go to the movies, watch Godzilla versus Kong, and then watch Art House movie. Do it all and just don't be a snobby dickhead about it, I think is what is really important. And then that's what kind of builds your people come and find you, and you can go find them, and it's actually really great.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you said, Bev. Bev's just great. We all love everything she said.
We all agree. Yeah. We couldn't agree more. It's not possible.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say about being someone who I guess kind of plays the role of, I guess, a sort of voice of authority, right? People listen to you because I want to know your perspective on things. And this might, I think a lot of people think of me as a very opinionated, confident person in their views. It's really not true. There's a couple of things I feel very sure about, right? Like my love for the Godfather franchise, my love for Kanye West. But there's a lot of things that I feel less sure about. I never studied film. I dropped out of university. I found my way into culture writing, criticism, very accidentally. And I think I sometimes find myself intimidated in conversations with people whose expertise and entire life is like this. The thing about film festivals when they were happening in real life is you could watch a movie with a bunch of really smart people, have a drink at the bar afterwards, and oh, cool, that's 5 reasons why that was a good or a bad movie that sort of gel with my view. I'm going to my view is going to be shaped by that. I think film festivals moving online, on one hand, have been so great, and particularly for accessibility, right? How many times have you been to a film festival, and if you've got a full-time job, you can't take Wednesday off to go and see that, and you might miss out. Now you can watch it online. That's one little silver lining in this. But you miss that interaction with other people in this kind of community. And I don't think it's about necessarily stealing their views, but it's about having those sharp and interesting and fun conversations over the dinner after the screening. And that helps you clarify what you think. So when it's your turn to be a podcast host or a critic and share that with the audience, you've kind of thought it through. I think lacking that opportunity, I find myself being a bit more reserved and a bit more guarded because I haven't tested out my views, I think, in the way that I would have previously.
But also, we live in a world where people are so wedded to views, I think, particularly with things like films. You're kind of expected to instantly form an opinion as you're walking out. And of course, for people who love talking about movies, our opinions change all the time, and we encounter people with amazing opinions about movies. Beverley mentioned Magic Mike earlier, and it got me thinking about, for example, a film like Showgirls. I haven't met a film academic who doesn't admire Showgirls, in spite of its many faults as a film. But just because we know that pop culture can be amazing and reveal so much and have so much energy and excitement in and of itself. And the thing about that movie is that it had one critical opinion when it came out. And again, with time, people talked about it, people watched it at parties, and then the consensus around it started to shift a little bit. And I love having that conversation at the bar afterwards, because I'm not necessarily going to notice everything about a particular film at one point. And I think this is something that is emerging in this conversation, which is that films or TV shows, they don't exist in a bubble. They come into being by talking about them and by exchanging opinions and by living with them and then seeing them again a few years later. They're not over when you leave the cinema. A great film will stay with you and return to conversations.
I love that. I just want to say that I love that. That's great. I also heartily agree.
Absolutely. We're all in agreement in this conversation. Right. I think Showgirls is kind of the perfect example, alongside Magic Mike, of something we've been almost dancing around, with this whole, dancing around either scantily clad or fully clothed. With this conversation is the complete breakdown of the high art and the low art, if you will. I think people's opinions have kind of shifted so much over the last year of applying the same appraisal and critical appraisal of something people would deem low art or the experience of it. And I think that's completely shifted, and people are so much more open and just going, we love the things that we love and why we love them. Do you guys feel the same way? Those barriers have broken down of snobbery a lot more?
I really hope so, because I find snobbery so boring. I hate it so much. I think of like I was thinking about something I was watching. Let me start again because that was a total jumble. I was thinking about some of the series that I was watching, maybe 2020. I'm just going to take a stab. It was last year. And I started to watch a lot of K-dramas because Netflix has so many Korean dramas. You don't even know. Like once you just get into that algorithm, it's going to just keep serving them up to you. So I was watching all of these. And then I would go and I would find the handsome star on Instagram and then I would follow him. And then I would realize I'm old enough to be his mother, but that's okay. Whatever, that's fine. And we had listeners writing to us and saying, I'm so happy that you talked about K-dramas on your show because here in Australia, they don't get much love. It's kind of this secret thing that I do by myself. And it just is so freeing to hear that you are watching them too, and you're happily talking about that. So I think that, yeah, maybe some of those, I don't know, cultural silos are being broken down. And I think, talking about the streaming services, when you have all these international shows up there, there's like, again, what's going to happen if you go and you choose something that's totally unfamiliar to you? You try it out for a couple of minutes, you might like it and keep going, or you stop watching it. But it's there for you. And I think because we're spending so much time inside, it's just a natural progression that people are going to try to watch things that they've passed by before.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think we saw something similar with music happen in the last sort of 10 years, right? This phenomenon, this movement of poptimism, when pop music was kind of reclaimed as a something worthy of cultural critique and interrogation. And I think the same thing is happening across all forms of culture. But I don't think it's happening accidentally, right? Like I think there's probably two things driving it. I think one is, as Bev said, streaming services have just smashed the model of like who gets to decide what you watch. For so long, it was decided by a small handful of people, overwhelmingly, middle-aged white dudes that say this is television that deserves to get made, commissioned, and broadcast at the right times to create energy and excitement around it. But I also think in terms of the people who tell you what to watch or critique things or decide even what is worthy of critique has shifted. I mean, kind of looking at all of you guys on this screen, 20 years ago, I imagine that instead of the four of us, it'd be four Anglo men in their 50s talking about serious films that should be interrogated and critiqued. Magic Mike showgirls wouldn't feature in that conversation. Reality TV K-drama wouldn't feature in that conversation. And then people like Doreen St. Felix, people like Emily Nussbaum, all these people who I think have played an important role in helping us understand that everything is valid, everything is enjoyable to someone. And even if you don't, like, I find this in my job, I don't see it sometimes my job to just decide what I like and tell people about it. If something is popular and interesting, even if I haven't necessarily connected with it, I make it my job to try and figure out why, because if that's connecting with a big enough group of people, it warrants attention and it warrants interest. I think that's a good, healthy thing that's emerging in the last few years.
And I would also jump in and say one thing that I think a lot of people have missed in the pandemic was those big tentpole movies that you would go and see, and they've just been moved back. The Black Widow film, for example, the Dune adaptation, and of course, something like Mortal Kombat. You saw Godzilla vs. Kong. When I could get to the cinema, I went and saw the Mortal Kombat movie because, of course, it was made in Australia and it's an Australian film, so I have to support the local Australian productions. But it's just so nice to be back in a cinema and with popcorn and that pop culture experience, which was not available and continues to be unavailable, unfortunately, to so many of us. But I just wanted to bring in one more movie about dancers and to encapsulate your point, Oz, about music and movies. And I would just say J-Lo in Hustlers dancing to Fiona Apple. Perfect merge of pop culture, alternative culture, music culture, movie culture.
Rock and roll.
Thank you, Janice.
Oh, my God. I have a flutter in my heart when you brought up Hustlers, one of my favorite movies in the last few years.
So good.
I've actually got tears coming out. It's just really... just the emotion, the idea of being back in the movies to watch a movie like Hustlers. It's very,
and listen to Fiona Apple.
Absolutely. I think I've got a feeling where the four of us should meet up when the lockdown start ending. Some kind of club is what I'm suggesting for us to all hang out and have a few drinks at.
Sounds good.
Before we wrap things up on the podcast, what am I doing? My God, Janice, can you take away what you were going to say here and I'll reform what I'm trying to say?
I was just thinking we should program a series of movies about dancers and just have a big party of dancer movies, because I think, and there are ones that were made in the 20s and the 60s. I think we could probably find one from every decade to enjoy.
I love that idea.
Well, that will be our film festival. Yeah, I can't wait to do it. Before we wrap things up in the discussion today, one thing that we touched on that I've kind of grown curious about is the idea of pandemic art and these pandemic films. The closing night film at the Melbourne Film Festival this year is Language Lessons, which kind of is a Zoom film that we've seen a few of in the last year or so. What are your feelings on this kind of like idea of films taking place during this, or TV shows taking advantage of like these new almost screen lifey cultures or pandemic art? Have you seen any that you feel transcend that form at all, or things that are interesting? What are your feelings on them? Oz, I'd start with you.
I actually have been thinking about this so much. My initial reaction and the way that I've been feeling about this up until very recently is one of recoilment. Like, I have felt like whilst we're in the middle of this, I want culture to be an escape from it, right? I personally want to watch wholesome, fun, silly things that don't remind me of the horrible state of the world that we're in. But I at the same time, that has sat a little bit uncomfortably with me, because art's role, in my view, is to help us interpret and understand and think about what's going on in the world. So to pretend that this pandemic hasn't fundamentally changed the way that we live and think and make stuff seems a bit naive. The show that I'm watching at the moment that I think is doing such an incredible job of grappling with the pandemic in a way that sort of, it doesn't feel overwhelming, but it feels important still, is The Good Fight, which is one of my favorite shows. It's a weird show. I don't think a lot of people in Australia watch. In fact, I think the ratings even in the States aren't that big. But they had to finish their production of last year's season early because of COVID. They've come back, and the show is made in a very traditional way. They're not using Zoom or anything like that, but they recognize that COVID in the past year has fundamentally transformed America. So there are plot lines about what does it mean to be a black or brown person entering a hospital in Chicago and the kind of level of service you got versus a wealthier white person. What does it mean to have people who are back in society but suffering the symptoms of long COVID? And I think what I like about that is it's not art it's not made on Zoom, so you're not having a kind of panic attack watching it and thinking about how stressful the world is, but it's still kind of an escape, but it's an escape that deals with the themes that I think we all need to grapple with as we come out of this pandemic.
Yeah, and I would agree in that as much as I have been advocating for the popular and how much I love it, of course we must have the cinema and the television that really deals with this and shows us a way to think about it and to push those boundaries and to confront these things. So I expect that will come. In terms of the question around Zoom movies, I haven't watched them. I think everyone's looking for the next found footage type of innovation. Is it going to be the desktop movie? Is it going to be the pandemic Zoom movie? I don't know yet. I think it will depend on how well it's used, but I certainly think I'm already waiting for the response to this cultural moment. It's already happening. I think it will continue to come through in the films and the shows that get made for many years, I'm certain.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm thinking about where I'm seeing responses to the pandemic in media, and I think that the most responsive place is social media. So a kind of screen culture, but not the screen culture that we're talking about for a film festival or even TV. And Oz, I think you're right about addressing the themes without freaking us out as a collective society, making it too close to what we're literally experiencing, not being able to go outside and like being stuck in these interminable Zoom meetings. So like formally, maybe there's a bigger conversation to think about how we approach that. But I think you're spot on there with the themes that you're describing.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because we've kind of seen it kind of be grappled with in real time as well, like people trying to adjust to like filmmaking process and getting your film out there in a like whole new different way. And it has been a lot of that found footagey thing. That's kind of like where my mind goes to straight away. There was a film I saw last year that was filmed over Zoom for the horror streaming service Shudder, called Host, which was a seance being filmed over Zoom. And it was kind of how enthralling it was to like see something that mirrored what my own life experience looked like, which was just being reflected back from a laptop screen, but then have drama and thriller elements and horror elements applied to it as well, in kind of a way to kind of encapture what the experience was in that exact moment of people being stuck at home and stuck communicating with their friends in ways that were still new to them. And yeah, I'm kind of interested. Do you guys see, where do you think things are heading with in the future as far as like popular culture consumption goes and how we interact with art that is kind of still about this moment?
I think Host is a really interesting shout. That was one of two Zoomy movies that I saw, and it was one that I really liked. I think it's the Anne Hathaway one that came out late last year, which was like filmed at the start of the pandemic, and by the time it came out, it was kind of like, no, gags about like your Zoom still being on when your partner walks in the back. We've done this. I'm tired of this. I think this maybe steps on a little bit of what I said before, but I think rather than it being so focused on the medium, the format of telling the stories, I think, Zooms are here to stay. So much of this is here to stay, but I almost think in some ways it's the lazier way to grapple with what the future looks like. I think the harder thing to do is to just use the traditional forms of the craft and storytelling to make us think about beyond middle-class people like us having to do Zoom instead of real meetings. What does this moment really mean for the world?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, for me, when I think about the film that most captured the pandemic happening, I think of the Borat sequel. Just in how they were making that movie, and then suddenly the whole thing kind of shifted gear because of the pandemic and the way that they incorporated that into the movie. But that's not what Oz is talking about, So really the question is how will art respond? How will media respond? And how will humans respond as well in their engagement with it? And I don't know. I think the answer is still forthcoming. I think people will want to see things that make sense of their experience, and they will seek it out probably on every level, really, on the level of the experimental and art, whatever that means, and the popular, whatever that means. I think the jury's still out, and we're still so much in it. So, yeah, I'm gonna wait and see. I think it's going to be very interesting what happens next.
I'm totally happy not to say anything here. I feel like you guys nailed it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
That was great. I was going to say, does anyone have any final thoughts before we wrap things up here? I can see that counter ticking down.
I've talked a lot. I'm fine.
I feel like I feel like we're in mad agreement, and I'm good. I'm good. Is there anything that you think that we didn't cover?
I mean, I feel really good about it. Janice, was there anything that you want to say?
I would just say that I think, particularly with something like film or cinema, people often talk about the end, this is the end of traditional cinema. This is the end of traditional media because of this huge cataclysm. But I think there's a critic in the US called Nick Pinkerton, and he says, no art form that's been born to the world has ever left the world. And so I think that, yes, this is a huge turning point, but I think that things like cinema and television and media, they're going to continue. They're going to be changed, but I think that we can expect more. And I think it's wonderful that events like MIFF continue, and I expect them to continue for many years. So,
Janice, that's such a beautiful, hopeful note to kind of leave this conversation on. I'm actually quite moved by it. The way that I see cinema, it's like the church. You don't have to pray at the church to still be practicing the religion. You can pray at home by watching movies at home as well. And hopefully that's what everybody watching this here will be doing this Melbourne International Film Festival season. But thank you so much for joining me on this chat today with this MIFF talk. I couldn't have enjoyed myself more. I couldn't have been joined by three more fascinatingly minded popular culture aficionados. So thank you so much, Beverley, Osman, and Janice, for joining us here today on MIFF Talks.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you.